Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Today, we're opening a file that, honestly, it feels less like a history lesson and more like a high-stakes theological thriller. We're looking at the Masonic correspondence of George Washington. But here's the thing. We aren't just talking about, secret handshakes or aprons. We're witnessing a battle of ideas, a battle about the divine, right in his own letters. We see Washington caught in this crossfire between his belief in a grand architect of the universe and this rising, almost panic-stricken fear of an atheistic conspiracy. A conspiracy many people believed was coming to destroy all religion, all government. It's almost Washington versus the death of God.
It really is. It's a fascinating angle that you just don't get in the usual biographies. I mean, normally we see Washington the general, or Washington the president, stoic, a statue. But in this stack of documents, we see Washington the believer, a man who has to defend his entire spiritual worldview against a preacher who's basically accusing his inner circle of being, well, godless conspirators.
Exactly. It's a narrative that feels so incredibly modern. You've got conspiracy theories, fears about the loss of faith, and a leader just trying to maintain some kind of order. So today we're going to unpack how Washington defined God, how he responded to this accusation of atheism, and ultimately what he believed happens when we die.
And just to raise the stakes, the villain in this story, if you can call him that, is a man named G.W. Snyder. He sends Washington a book claiming the Illuminati are coming to wipe out Christianity. So this isn't some dry archival work. This is about the survival of a nation's soul.
Before we jump right into that crossfire, though, I just have a quick request for everyone listening. If you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button. It really helps us keep these deep dives going and, helps us find more of these hidden historical gems. Okay, so let's set the stage. We're diving into a world where God isn't always called God.
Right. And this is so crucial for understanding Washington's mindset. If you look at the documents, specifically the Watson and Cassell correspondence from 1782, or the address from the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania a decade later, the language is very distinct. Washington and the men writing to him, they don't typically use the standard church language of the day. They aren't quoting scripture in every sentence.
Yeah, I noticed that immediately. I was reading that letter about Watson and Cassell, and just to give some context, these were business partners in France. And in 1782, Watson sends Washington a gift, a Masonic apron. But not just any apron. It was embroidered by Catholic nuns in Nantes.
That image alone is wild, isn't it? You've got a Protestant American general who just defeated the British, receiving Masonic regalia made by Catholic nuns in France. It just speaks to this universality that Washington clearly appreciated, a worldview that goes beyond specific denominations.
But look at how he thanks them. This is where that theological language starts to get really interesting. He writes that if his efforts to save the country from tyranny are successful, the praise is due to the grand architect of the universe.
The grand architect, it's such a specific title.
It is. It feels, constructed. He doesn't say the Father or the Lord or Jesus. He says the architect. So what does that tell us? I mean, how did Washington view the divine? Is he avoiding religion or is he defining it in a different way?
I don't think he's avoiding it at all.
Huh.
I think he is defining God primarily as an order bringer, a builder. Think about the metaphor of an architect. An architect draws a blueprint. They calculate loads and stresses. They ensure stability. In the Masonic worldview you see in these letters, the universe is not some chaotic accident. It's a structure. It has a design.
So God is the engineer-in-chief.
Essentially, yes. Washington writes that this grand architect did not see fit to suffer his superstructure's injustice, to be subjected to ambition. He sees the American experiment, this temple of liberty, as they often call it, as something built under the direct supervision of this supreme being.
So it's not just a poetic metaphor for him.
No, I don't think so. For Washington, this architectural language was a way to sort of bridge the gap. It implies a creator who has a plan, a blueprint. And if you follow that blueprint, if you act on the square, as they say, you are aligning yourself with the divine will. It's a very active structural faith. It suggests that if you build correctly, the building stands. If you ignore the architect, well, the building collapses.
And it seems this faith wasn't just limited to building a country here on Earth. I was really struck by that address from the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania in 1792. They aren't just wishing him a happy retirement. There's a very specific wish for his future.
No, it's a beautiful passage. They write to him hoping that he is eventually admitted to the Celestial Lodge, where cherubim and seraphim will hail him as a brother.
The Celestial Lodge, so that's the afterlife.
Exactly. And that establishes a firm belief in a divine hierarchy and an existence beyond death. This really counters the idea that Washington was some kind of distant deist, the clockmaker god who built the world and then just walked away. The God in these letters is presiding, he is watching the construction, and he prepares a place for the workmen when they finally put down their tools.
Okay, so let's just pause and summarize let's call it the good side of the equation here. We have Washington's view. God is the great master builder. The universe is his building. There is a plan, and there is an afterlife. The Celestial Lodge, it all sounds very orderly, very safe.
It was a worldview based on harmony, on geometry, but then we hit 1798, and the tone of the correspondence just shifts dramatically.
Enter G.W. Snyder. And this is where the story takes a turn that I honestly did not expect to find in the Library of Congress archives. Who was this guy?
G.W. Snyder was a preacher from Fredericktown, Maryland. And he was, let's say, highly concerned. You have to remember the context here. It's 1798. The French Revolution had turned incredibly bloody. The Reign of Terror had happened. Traditional religion in France was being dismantled in favor of the, quote, cult of reason.
Right, they were chopping off heads and renaming the months. I mean, total chaos.
Exactly. And Snyder is terrified that this infection, as he calls it, is coming to America. So he writes to George Washington, the retired president, the living legend, and he sends him a book. It's called Proofs of a Conspiracy by John Robeson.
And the conspiracy isn't a small one. Snyder explicitly warns Washington that there's a group called the Illuminati, yes, the actual Illuminati, and their plan is to overturn all government and all religion.
And specifically, Snyder points the finger at Freemasonry. He tells Washington that the Illuminati have infiltrated the lodges in Europe. He talks about men who have adopted a philosophy that reduces humans to just, well, biology.
There is a line in Snyder's letter that really caught my attention. He describes these conspirators as men who distinguish man from beast by his shape only.
That is a brutal line. Distinguish man from beast by his shape only.
It's the ultimate definition of atheistic materialism, isn't it? He's saying that if you take away the grand architect, if you take away the soul, a human being is just a smart animal.
Precisely. That is the theological heart of this conflict. Snyder is presenting a worldview where there is no grand architect, no celestial lodge, just matter. And he's accusing the lodges, the very institutions Washington loves, of being the vehicles for this godlessness. He's essentially asking Washington, are you and your friends secret atheists trying to destroy God?
Talk about an awkward letter to open at breakfast. Dear General Washington, are you a secret agent of chaos? But here's what I love about Washington. He doesn't just toss this in the fire. He replies.
He does. And this is where it gets really interesting. Washington takes about a month to reply. He had been sick, he was busy, but his response is so nuanced, he doesn't dismiss the conspiracy theory entirely.
No, he admits he's heard of it. He writes to Snyder in September of '98 saying he's heard of the nefarious and dangerous plan of the Illuminati.
Washington was a pragmatist. He looked at Europe, at the chaos of the French Revolution, and he agreed that there were doctrines of the Illuminati and principles of Jacobinism that were dangerous. He didn't deny that there were forces trying to separate the people from their government and from their God.
But, and this is a huge but, he draws a line in the sand when it comes to the American lodges.
Oh, he defends them vehemently. He tells Snyder, essentially, I believe the lodges in this country are not contaminated with these diabolical tenets.
Diabolical tenets. He's not mincing words there. He views atheism, this removal of the divine, as actually diabolical.
That's the key. Washington defines Freemasonry in these letters as being founded in benevolence and to be exercised only for the good of mankind. To him, that is completely incompatible with the atheistic conspiracy Snyder is afraid of. Washington is arguing that true Masonry, well, it requires the grand architect. If you remove the architect...
It's not Masonry anymore.
Exactly. It's something else entirely.
There's a specific detail in the draft of his letter to the Grand Lodge of Maryland that really stood out to me. It's a crossed out line. I always feel like we get the real truth when we look at what people delete.
Oh, yes. The draft from November 1798.
Right. So Washington's writing this defense, and in the draft he writes, then he crosses it out, a sentence, saying that if Masonry was used for improper or nefarious objects, it's a proof that, in unworthy hands, the best institutions may be made use of to promote the worst designs.
It shows his internal thought process. He recognizes the institution is good. It's one of the best institutions. But he's aware that bad actors could hijack it. He deletes it, probably to be more diplomatic or firm in his final letter, but it reveals he understood Snyder's fear. He got it. He understood that a tool for building could be used for destroying if unworthy hands took over.
So for Washington, the defense against this atheist threat wasn't to abandon the lodges, but to just assert that the American lodges were still under the guidance of the Grand Architect. He's saying, we are not the guys you're looking for.
Exactly. He's saying, we are the builders, they are the destroyers. And think about what building means to Washington. It requires a standard, a plumb line.
Yeah.
If there is no God, there's no plumb line. There is no up or down, morally speaking.
That really clarifies why he was so adamant. If the man is just a beast theory takes over, the whole Temple of Liberty collapses because there's no moral foundation to hold it up.
Correct. And that brings us to the ultimate rejection of atheism in his correspondence, his view on death. Because if Snyder's fear was true, if these men were atheists, then death is just the end. It's lights out.
But Washington clearly didn't believe that. When we look at the letters about his death or, anticipating his death, that architectural language comes back in a huge way.
It does. And this is that celestial lodge concept we touched on earlier. If you look at the letters from the Grand Lodges of Massachusetts and South Carolina, they are constantly using this metaphor of two worlds.
The terrestrial lodge and the celestial lodge.
Yes. The terrestrial lodge is earthly life. It's where the work happens. Washington writes to the Alexandria Lodge about having acted on the square during his life. That's the work. That's the labor.
And then death isn't the end of the work. It's, what, a promotion.
It's a calling off from labor to refreshment. That is the specific Masonic terminology they use. The Grand Lodge of South Carolina prays that when Washington leaves the symbolic lodges of this world, he's received into the celestial lodge of light and perfection.
And Washington responds to that. He doesn't just say, thanks for the kind words. He writes back saying he hopes to meet them in that eternal temple.
And that, right there, is the definitive rebuttal to Snyder's fear of men of no religion. An atheist views death as the cessation of consciousness. The lights go out, the structure crumbles. Washington views death as moving from one room of the temple to a higher, more perfect room.
A transfer of membership.
In a way, yes. Washington viewed his entire life's work, winning the war, founding the presidency, managing his estate, as a building project. And it was a project performed under the eye of a supreme deity. It wasn't some chaotic accident of matter like Snyder feared the atheists believed. It was a drafted plan.
It's just so interesting to contrast the panic of Snyder with the calm of Washington. Snyder is frantic. He's sending books. He's writing these long, rambling letters about how the world is ending because people are losing their faith. Washington, well, he's Washington. He's calm. He basically says, I know the danger is there, but I trust the foundation we've built.
That's the essence of it. Washington didn't view God through strict dogma or denomination in these letters. You don't see him debating theology or scripture. You see him talking about order, beauty, and harmony. And to him, the Grand Architect was the guarantor of liberty.
So no architect, no liberty.
That seems to be his position. The diabolical tenets of that Illuminati, that atheistic movement, they were a threat, not just because they were anti-religious. They were a threat because they were anti-order. They threatened the moral fabric the nation was built on. If you remove the judge, there's no justice. If you remove the architect, the building has no structural integrity.
It really reframes how we look at the founding of the U.S., or at least Washington's role in it. We hear so much about the separation of church and state, which is true, but these letters suggest there was no separation of God and liberty in his mind.
That is a crucial distinction. He absolutely defended the right of conscience, but he could not conceive of a functioning free society that was purely materialistic or atheistic. The Temple of Liberty required a spiritual foundation to sustain it.
I want to go back to that phrase, order, beauty, and harmony. It sounds so peaceful, but in the context of 1798, it was a battle cry.
It was a defense against chaos.
Yeah.
You have to remember, the alternative they were seeing in Europe was the guillotine. It was mob rule. It was the complete breakdown of society. Washington's Masonic correspondence is basically a record of a man saying, we will not go down that road. We will keep the compass. We will keep the square. We will keep the architect.
And he kept that faith right to the very end. Even when he was retired, sending those last letters in 98 and 99, he's just so consistent.
Consistent and firm. He never wavered in his belief that the great architect was guiding the destiny of the United States, provided the workmen, the citizens, stayed true to the design.
So let's recap this whole journey. We started with a stack of letters and this question about God and atheism. And we found a Washington who wasn't just a passive believer, but an active defender of a designed universe.
Right, we went from a suspicious preacher, G.W. Snyder, fearing this atheistic conspiracy that would turn men into beasts, all the way to Washington's calm architectural rebuttal. Snyder feared the loss of God would destroy government. Washington argued that the very institution Snyder attacked, Freemasonry, was actually a fortress for the belief in God, as long as it remained true to its American principles.
It's just a fascinating snapshot of a mind we so often treat as a monument. Here we actually see him thinking, debating, defending his spiritual territory.
And doing it with a level of sophistication that I think we often miss. He navigates the Illuminati panic, which was a real media frenzy of its time, without losing his head and without conceding his principles. He stood in that gap between religious panic and atheistic chaos, and he just pointed to the architect.
So what does this all mean for us? Why does it matter that Washington believed in a grand architect and not just, a clockmaker?
I think it matters because it speaks to the intention behind the whole American project. Washington didn't see the nation as a random occurrence. He saw it as a structure that needed to be maintained. And that maintenance required a moral framework, a belief in something higher than just human ambition.
Which brings us to a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over. Washington clearly believed that the Temple of Liberty required a grand architect to sustain it. He believed the entire structure relied on that cornerstone.
So here's the question I would leave you with. If Snyder's fear had come true, if the architect were truly removed from the equation, did Washington believe the temple would collapse? And in our modern world, which is often wrestling with these exact same questions of faith and reason and science, does that architectural view of the divine still hold the foundation together? Or can the building stand without the architect?
That is a heavy question to end on, but that's why we do this. We unpack the past to understand the present. Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive.